should be. Or maybe it doesn't work. Is it not working?
Well, I can just use the pointer. That'll be fine.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, great. Thank you all for coming today. It's my pleasure to be here. I switched up my title a little bit. I saw that the people following me are going to talk about fertilizers, and then there's another one on nitrogen credits. And so I'm going to focus a little more on soil organic matter and just try to provide sort of the basis of what's happening in soils, and then relate it back to nitrogen towards the end. So I think it'll hopefully nicely transition to the next presentations. So I just want to start by maybe get an idea in this room. What do we think soil organic matter is? Does anyone have an idea or want to venture a guess?
Soil particle.
Anything different than a mineral particle. Okay, that's maybe not anything, but yes, it's definitely different than a mineral particle. What other attributes might it have? Where does it come from? Right, so generally we're talking about organic residues are dead plants by and large. Sometimes those get processed or become animals or microbes, and those die, and they can also contribute to organic matter. And they're generally in various stages of decomposition. So that's like the real basic definition of what soil organic matter is. When we talk about operationally, if you go send your sample off to a lab and they tell you how much you get back, they only take particles less than 2 millimeters, so that's about 1/12 of an inch. If it's bigger than that, then it's still considered plant residues and not officially organic matter, although it may be doing similar things.
Wait a minute, can we ask questions while we're here?
Sure. If I go over time, though, don't get upset.
Wait a minute, if I send a soil sample and it has straw and stuff and it's bigger than that size, what is that? What do they call that? The sample?
It'll come out as residues. So it's not acting the same way. It doesn't have the same size and it doesn't have the same sort of surface area to allow the microbial action on it. So it's really not. It will soon become soil organic matter, but it's not at the time that you send it in.
If you give me back the soil sample with a percentage on it, and that doesn't include that?
Usually not. If the lab does it right, they shouldn't. Although honestly, I mean, it seems like it's a lot of material, but that stuff doesn't weigh very much. And it's really not that much of the overall carbon in there, in your soil. So it's not contributing a whole lot, even though it's visibly what you see. So. Okay, we come back to that later if you want. Okay, so soil organic matter, is a lot of different things put together. But a lot of it's carbon, right? So we will hear the term soil carbon and soil organic matter, or soil organic carbon and soil organic matter used sort of synonymously sometimes. And basically, we apply this correction factor where we know that about 58% of organic matter is carbon. So what usually gets measured in the lab is carbon, and then they just multiply times 1.72 to account that it's 58%, and you get an organic matter number back. But it's basically the same thing. No matter what we're talking about, it's soil organic carbon or organic matter. Just because I'll use those interchangeably, I want to make sure there's no confusion there, and no confusion when you're hearing about this in the future. On average, this soil organic matter, and soils in general, have a ratio of carbon to nitrogen that's about 10:1. So there's 10 atoms of carbon to 1 atom of nitrogen. And that can vary a little bit. It might be up towards even 15:1, but soils, universally are 10:1 or 12:1 maybe. And this ratio is held pretty tightly. And so generally when we're talking about soil organic matter, we're talking about carbon, but we're also talking about nitrogen. And so we can say that soil organic matter is based on that. If it's 58% carbon, then it's about 5 or 6% nitrogen, right? So when we're talking about soil organic matter, we are talking about nitrogen. And most nitrogen in soils is held in soil organic matter.
So when you say 58% carbon, is that the same thing, 58% organic matter?
No, so when we say a soil has 3% organic matter, if you wanted to go back and calculate how much carbon that is, you would say, okay, 58% of that 3% is carbon, so it would be about 2/3, right? So you would say it's about 2% carbon. And that's actually what's measured in the lab. That's why I'm making a point out of it. And they back calculate because we're used to talking about soil organic matter. Okay. Okay, so editing. Complex, that's supposed to say. So soil organic matter is a complex mix of organic molecules, often in close association with clay minerals. So this is a little tiny fleck of clay that you can't even see in the soil, and they have a lot of surface area and they have a charge to them, and little bits of soil organic matter that can get more complex as microbes chew them up and they become more complex molecules. They will bind. Why am I getting that box there? Do we know?
I just think this looks funny.
Is this not normal?
Sorry, I'm recording this, and then
So-
I'll eventually turn it into an actual video,
you
so that if
play
you
and-
guys wanted to,
Camera preview. There we go.
bam.
Thank you. Okay, so a lot of organic matter is sitting loose in the soil, but a lot of it will bind to these particles of clay, and that's what ends up stabilizing it a lot in soils. So if you have more clay in your soil, you'll tend to have more organic matter because more of it's protected, and it gets stuck so tightly on these clays that microbes can't go in and chew it off. And so I just want to recognize that we do have free floating organic matter in soils, but a lot of it's actually, if you have clay in your soils or smaller minerals like silt, that's where a lot of it's attached to. Oops. So we have organic matter. We talk about it as this kind of broad pool, but there's actually a lot of different functions and a lot of different forms in the soil, and I'll get into this a little more in a minute, but some of it is fresh residues. Some of it's actually living organisms. When you send your sample in, so fresh residues less than 2 millimeters, or fungi or whatnot, that can make up a significant portion, small proportion, but of your soil organic matter. And then there's parts that are more stable too. So there's things that are actively decaying, and then there's very stable organic matter that's maybe stuck on those clay particles. And so it's not just one big homogeneous unit. There's all sorts of different components of this organic matter doing different things in the soil, and that's one of the main points I want to try to get across today. Okay, so now I've explained what it is. Why do we care about soil organic matter? Or do we? Do any of you care about it? Why?
Because that's where your nutrients for the plants that you're growing
Right, so it's a source of nutrients. Any other reasons we might care about it?
stabilizes the soil so that big rains don't wash it away.
Right, so it's contributing to soil structure. Any other ideas? Holds moisture, yeah. So those are some of the really important things that you most commonly hear. I'll also add, so yeah, we mentioned water, we mentioned structure, nutrient source and retention. It's also sort of the basis and the supporting all of our soil biology, which is contributing to a whole range of functions that are making our soils more productive and making nutrient cycle better. And it also contributes to climate regulation. So when we talk about soil water, I bring this one up because this is probably the one I hear most from producers. And this is the classic paper that is cited over and over again, showing how basically this is plant wilting point and this is field capacity. And the difference between those is what we call available water content. And so this is basically showing in this paper, they looked at a bunch of different soils and they said, well, as our organic matter goes from 1.5% to 5%, our available water content essentially doubles, right? And so these numbers are used very widely and cited quite a lot. Or you can look at it as they also looked at they looked at how this is affecting in different texture soils, and they suggested that in sandier soils this trend's even stronger than in clay soils. Actually can hold quite a bit of water on their own, right? So the coarser texture soils are, the more this organic matter is helping. And this has been common wisdom for a long time and still is. But I just want to mention that there's some recent literature suggesting that maybe it's not quite as pretty as it looks here, in the sense that a new study came out just last year, looking at a lot more data points. I think they used about 100 or 200 data points. This new study used 50,000 data points and suggested that while, yes, soil organic matter increases water holding capacity, the slope of that curve is not nearly as steep. And they're saying with a 1% increase in organic matter, so from going from 1 to 2%, you're only getting about a 1.2 16% increase in water holding capacity, averaged across soils. They do say, however, it's a little steeper and better on sandier soils, as this first paper suggested, but I just want to throw that out there that we are still learning about this stuff, and it's important to sort of challenge old dogmas. And while soil organic matter is certainly important for water, it may get overemphasized sometimes. Okay, so soil organic matter is also really important for building aggregates and soil structure. So this is an aggregate, and this is actually a small microaggregate. As you can see, this organic matter core here, which is basically microbes start decomposing it, and then they turn that organic matter, and what they excrete basically becomes the glue that holds those aggregates together. Those aggregates can then form into larger aggregates, and that's basically what we talk about when we're talking about soil structure, right? So here's a graph just showing that across a bunch of different soils, as you increase soil organic carbon or soil organic matter, the overall aggregation and the stability of those aggregates increases. Why do we want stable aggregates, right? So one reason is, we have a well-aggregated soil like this versus a poorly aggregated soil like this. What happens when you get a big rainstorm is basically you get faster infiltration here, right? So you get more water captured, and you're going to have less runoff, less potential for erosion. Your soil's not going to wash away. So with that better aggregation, we can also get less potential wind erosion. But we're saying, so we get increased infiltration, increased aeration, water capture, erosion control, but also easier root penetration by your crops. So that's a good benefit of organic matter that we want. Also, when you have organic matter, this is looking at how cation exchange capacity, so this is the capacity of soils to really hold on to nutrients, how it increases, from a sand that has almost no cation exchange capacity because it has no charge, to a clay soil does much better, but then one bit, for every piece of organic matter you have in there has, even 10 times the capacity to hold on to nutrients as potentially as clay. So having even a little bit of organic matter can really increase your cation exchange capacity and your ability to hold on to nutrients and not lose them to leaching or other potential losses. Okay, so it was also mentioned that this organic matter is a source of nutrients, right? I'm going to focus on nitrogen because that was my task today, but same story, a little slightly different cycles is happening for other nutrients like potassium and phosphorus as well. So we often, think of the general, thought as we add our fertilizer to soils, it goes into what we call a pool of mineral nitrogen in the soil. This is readily available to plants. Our crop takes that up and grows, right? But there's a lot more that happens to that nitrogen when it goes into the soil. And Katie's going to talk about this more in the next presentation. But that nitrogen, okay, step back one second. So first off, it's important to recognize of that nitrogen that we apply, we're lucky if half of it makes it into the plant, right? On average, half or less, depending on your system and your soils, actually makes it into the crop. So that means, well, what happens to the rest of it, right? So we can have losses. If you have a sandier soil especially, in a rainy situation, you can lose a lot to leaching. Quite a bit can get blown off just as nitrogen gas, and also a little bit of nitrous oxide, but quite a bit can go off through denitrification and nitrogen gas. Some of it is also immediately going into this organic soil pool. It's getting used by soil microbes and being incorporated into their bodies, and they're competing essentially, is one way to think about it, with the crop for that nitrogen. Right? But then that organic pool can then actually release nitrogen back to the mineral pool to be utilized by the crop. So when we say that 50% of it's not going in to only 50% of what you apply is going to the crop, where's the other 50% coming from really? Or where's the rest of the crop nutrition coming from? Because we generally are applying based on sort of what our export's going to be in our crop. And so that means that the rest of that nitrogen is coming from the soil organic matter and from those microbes that are potentially cycling old residues and whatnot going in the soil. So when we export nitrogen off, we also return residues back to that organic matter pool, and that becomes available for potentially the next year to support our crop again, right? Does that make sense?
So does it matter on the 50%, does it matter whether it's liquid, dry fertilizer? Is it always 50%? I mean, in the Midwest, they do anhydrous ammonia.
It's going to depend a lot on the cropping system, on the soils, on the fertilizers you apply. I've seen numbers down as low as like 20–30%, but I'm sure it gets higher than that if you're able to, and that's what Katie's going to talk about too, with placement, type of fertilizer and all that to try to maximize that. So I'm just going to say on average across, agricultural systems globally, you're lucky if you get 50%. So at least in the literature I come across. We'll see if Katie has another story. One example of this is some work I did actually down in Mexico, but same things apply here. This is a really sandy soil where they were looking at the effects of conservation agriculture. So they were looking at the effects of either leaving residues on the field or exporting them off the field. And they're also looking at tilled versus no-till. And what they found here, and these soils are about 60% sand, so they are quite sandy. They found that just leaving the residues in place 1 year, we were able to capture about 40% more nitrogen in the crop. So we applied nitrogen using a 15N labeled isotope. We were able to trace it and pick up what we found, later in the year. And we looked at nitrogen recovered in the crop, the soil, and everything. And this is a system very prone to losses. And so we looked in the soil and the crop, and in the best situation, we found 40% recovery. That means 60% of the nitrogen we added was lost to the atmosphere or leached. And only about 30% made it in the plant. But that was down to about 30% total recovered when you didn't have those residues. Those residues were acting like organic matter, essentially, helping to improve the retention, increasing cation exchange capacity, but also helping to maybe immobilize temporarily. I'll get into that more in a minute. Some of that nitrogen and keep it from getting lost. So having a source of organic nitrogen, organic matter in the soils can help a lot with improving your overall fertilizer recovery and nitrogen use efficiency.
Wait, I got another question.
Yes, please.
You got tillage and no-till, and he shows residues was contained and removed. How do you remove residue on no-till? I don't understand.
Surface residues. Yeah, so they're grown corn. Sorry, give it a little more thing. And they're grown corn, and either they take all that corn stover off, and there in Mexico they use it to feed their animals.
Okay, that's what.
Or they're leaving it on the field, on the surface, as we saw, here. No, can't go backward. Apparently. Yeah, it doesn't like me to go backwards. It's okay. Well, I don't need to. But over here, there's a lot of residues on the ground. Here it's bare because they've taken them off. And then they've either tilled it in, they leave it on the surface. In this case, tillage didn't seem to matter much. This is only about 2 years into this experiment, so I think later on it may affect things. Does that answer your question? Another question, yeah.
On your soil type, does it swing or is it pretty steady on your nitrogen retention in that soil, or does it vary?
So this soil, as I said, is really sandy. There is very little nitrogen retention. There's very little organic matter. So in this case, adding even sort of a short-lived pulse of residues there, which is probably not going to last very long, functioned as organic matter, at least in the short term.
Would it be similar in a clay soil or not?
You wouldn't probably see this big of a difference in a clay soil, but there still should be some difference, right? Yeah, the sandy soil sort of exasperated the trend here. Okay, so soil organic matter is also important for supporting these soil biological communities, which can increase the efficiency and use of our fertilizers and other forms of nutrients in the soil. So we all know that earthworms are good. Talked about that last year. It was down this way. But also, a number of studies suggest if you have more organic matter, you also tend to have more beneficial microbes, things like mycorrhizal fungi, which can help increase your nutrient recovery by plants. Also, these critters are the ones that are kind of going through and chewing up the microbes and keeping that organic matter cycling and keeping the microbial biomass cycling, which then will release stuff for plants. So organic matter is really serving as the basis for all of these communities. And the more you have, generally the more you have of all of these things. Just to get an idea of how this, I'm always sort of impressed by these organisms and how many there are. So in 1 acre of soil, you can have up to 5 tons of living matter or living below ground things, not including roots. So we're talking microbes, earthworms, mites, nematodes, all that sort of stuff. And you may have 10,000 different species living in 1 single gram of soil, right? So just to put that in perspective, that 5 tons per acre, you could think of that as having, 8 large cows constantly moving around underneath your soil on every acre, right? And that can be, diversity in terms of, that may be hundreds to thousands of I lost my pointer. It's okay. Anyway, so that could be hundreds of thousands of earthworms. There can be, thousands of different types of nematodes and, like I said, biomass. So anyway, there can be a lot of different organisms working around in there doing lots of different things. What's that?
Does that count prairie dogs?
In some places it could, yeah. And then I'll just mention that there's also a lot of interest. I mentioned sort of climate regulation in soils, because soils really, at the bottom, you can't probably see the numbers there, but soils hold twice as much carbon as is in our atmosphere, and about 3 times is what is in all living vegetation. And so a small change in soil carbon can change quite substantially, the amount of CO2 we have in our atmosphere. And I mention this because, in some places there's a lot of, we're getting pretty close to developing carbon markets where you may actually start getting paid for sequestering carbon in your soils. So that's another potential benefit that, could actually affect your pocketbook at some point, in a very direct terms. Okay, so when we talk about soil organic matter, it's really driven by inputs versus outputs, right? So when we talk about inputs, it's how productive your system is. It's, are you adding, how many crops do you have in there, or in your rotation? Do you have cover crops? Are you adding compost, manure? Those are all organic inputs that are going to increase your soil organic matter. And then on the other side, it's all about losses. So you can increase your losses if you, make things warmer or wetter, or tillage is probably the thing we have the most control over. And that's a way to sort of increase your loss. And the balance of that sort of determines your soil organic matter pool. So we can do things, like I said, productivity, you can change your inflow, or with compost additions, whatever, you change your inflow. And tillage is really one of your major driver to change the outflow. And the potential size of that pool, and I don't really show that here, could depend on things like texture and maybe your mineralogy of your soils. So that's important to consider too, that not all soils can get up to the same level. Different textures have a lot of different potential. Just to show that this is changing or cultivating sort of from native prairie to cropping systems, we start putting less in, we disturb it more tillage. And these are all, you see as, with years of cropping, we're losing soil organic matter, but here they're showing it as total nitrogen, because I said that organic matter and nitrogen are very tightly linked in the soils, right? So in all of these soils, as they begin tilling, 30 years in, they're cutting their amount of nitrogen, total nitrogen in the soil, by half. So it's just important to recognize how these two things are really tied together. Okay, so I simplified this again, suggesting that there's all just this one pool, but unfortunately nothing's quite that simple, and we really need to think about, if we understand these sort of different components of the soil organic matter, that there's an active component and sort of a slow cycling component and then a very passive component, we can understand a little bit better and manage better for those nutrient provision services that we want from it, or or the other benefits. And these different pools have different effects. So our active pool is usually a pretty small pool, and it's mainly fresh residues. And if you were to at least look under a microscope, they'd be sort of recognizable bits of plants. You'd see plant cells and things like that. They could also be maybe really easily decomposable root exudates. Thank you. And they decay rapidly, but they're, like I said, a very small portion of the total. And we have the slow cycling pool, and these may be sort of more resistant molecules like lignin, or things like plant roots that still are decomposing, but they just happen on a slower time scale. It may be, instead of months, years before they're releasing nutrients. And sometimes, just the fact that you get things protected in aggregates can slow down its decomposition, irregardless of its overall quality. And then we have this passive pool, which is often things that have been chewed up by microbes and turned into more complex minerals and end up getting stuck on sort of clay and mineral surfaces. And that is by far the largest pool of soil organic matter, especially in more clayey soils, and it turns over really slow. So it's not contributing maybe a lot in terms of what's relative to what's there. It's not contributing a lot in nutrients, but it has other impacts or other potential benefits. That's what's contributing to things like cation exchange capacity and water holding capacity and those kind of things.
Question.
Yeah.
So.
Well,
say
can't go
you
backwards,
had-
sorry.
say you had your residue on top on a no-till, and then if you're doing, minimum till or reduced till or the old moldboard thing, which is faster? The faster then was saying that on the surface, correct?
Well, no, so I didn't mean to show that as being distributed throughout the soil profile. I was just trying to show sizes of pool, your relative amounts of these different components. Right, so yeah, it does work, especially in a no-till system, that easily decomposable stuff does end up sitting on the top. So that would actually be a nice analogy for a no-till system as well, in terms of how those pools are distributed. But in most soils, it can be completely mixed, especially if you're mixing it in. You can get, that active pool could be buried down 6 inches or 10 inches. So.
Hey, so
Yes.
back like 3 or 4 slides.
I can't go back, but yeah.
Where you're showing native prairie, not nitrogen in the soil, from native prairie to tilled for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah.
How long does it take to get the nitrogen level back to native prairie? Say you quit tilling and quit, CRP or whatever. How long would it take to get it back to that?
Right, so the only way you're probably going to do that is through CRP, unless you had a system where you're just putting so much organic matter that you're able to sort of be equivalent to a prairie with all those perennial roots, that are contributing a lot. I mean, it depends, but I've seen studies, where they go 10 and 20 years and they're not getting there yet. It depends, how productive your systems are and how fast things can grow and whatnot. So I think if you had a wet worm system, you might be able to get back there in 10 years. Around here, it may take 30 or 40 years. I don't have a strict number for you. I haven't seen data from around here, but.
Basically saying a 1-to-1. Take 1 year away, it takes another year to put back.
I think it goes a lot faster and it comes back. You see it dropped off kind of like that. So they were down pretty quick on that within 5 years or 10 years.
Well, I got a follow-up question with that too, is because if you look at the nitrogen level in old CRP fields, it's not anything like if you used to put it into hay. Is that even right to assume that?
Wait, so
Okay,
total.
have 2 fields.
Yeah.
They were both taken out at the same time, or no, cultivated for 30 years. They both lost some nitrogen. Then one day I decided to plant one to CRP, grass, and back to that. The other one I just rotated into an alfalfa crop. Would the recovery be the same, or would it? Because the chart dealt with nitrogen loss,
Yeah.
not organic matter.
Well, my point was that they're the same, basically. They should be the same. Okay, but when you have an alfalfa field, that could change your ratio a little bit because you're just dealing with a legume there. So your ratio of carbon and nitrogen may get a little tighter in that kind of system. And I think alfalfa is actually, it's a perennial legume and it's very productive. You're managing it to grow well, especially if you're watering it. You could probably that would probably restore the soil faster than a CRP if you're irrigating it. I mean, if we're basing it on soil carbon and nitrogen is our metric for restoration. Because you're allowing it to produce a lot more. You're increasing the inputs going into it. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, we can come back and talk later. I think I'm already over my time, so I gotta speed up.
Yeah, but you got a good presentation.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear there's lots of discussion. I hope it doesn't eat into our break too much. Okay, so another point I wanted, and I should say, this is a lecture I usually give in about 3 or 4 classes in my course at CSU, and I'm just trying to hit the highlights here in my 30 minutes I get here. So, okay, so one thing to recognize, and I just alluded to it there with those perennials, is that roots contribute relatively more to soil organic matter than shoots. So we can put on a typical corn plant, for example, you may have 3 times as much in terms of biomass shoots as roots. But at the end of the day, those roots are probably going to leave more soil organic matter behind, even if you tilled in those shoots. right? Because those roots just tend to be in tighter association with the mineral particles, with the microbes that are helping to stabilize them, and also maybe the quality of those roots is a little lower. So roots are really important for building soil organic matter, and that's why having perennials and deep-rooted things, or grasses and alfalfa and whatnot, can really go a long way towards restoring soil organic matter more quickly than other types of crops. That being said, it's not like you don't want the shoots. In a lot of cases, shoots decompose faster. And so that's another type of active soil organic matter, the one that's actually decomposing and providing nitrogen to our crop. Right? So they both have their function and they both need to be managed. And then I say, so since roots are contributing more to these passive pools, they're going to be supporting other functions, as I mentioned before, like cation exchange capacity and water holding capacity, maybe aggregation. So they're both, you don't want to just think of one and disregard the other. We have to kind of be thinking about both of them when we try to restore soils or just managing our nutrients. Okay, so I guess here what I wanted to get across is, we have different types of residues coming in, either from our crop or maybe a cover crop or manure. Those residues immediately start decomposing. They're releasing carbon dioxide, so the carbon associated with that organic matter is getting blown back off to the atmosphere, whereas the nitrogen is generally getting turned into ammonium, and that process is called mineralization, right? And as that happens, some of that carbon gets blown off, and some of the nitrogen gets released as ammonium, and some of it goes down to the next sort of pool of soil organic matter. So in this case, I'm talking it goes into the active pool, which is still turning over a lot. That active pool is going to continue to degrade. It's going to release more CO2 and more ammonium, and it's going to contribute to this more slow and passive pools. And those passive pools, they're really big, and they're still decomposing. And while they're not releasing as a percentage very much of their nitrogen and nutrients, they're decomposing, they're so big that they're still contributing ammonium to the pool and they're still contributing CO2 out to the atmosphere, right? So it's just important to recognize that all these pools are contributing to nutrient cycling and our nitrogen budget in a bunch of different ways. And then I'll kind of skip the rest of this because I think I've already kind of mentioned it. I think we're good. No? It's pointing? No? Okay. So when we're talking about managing our soil organic matter and our residues, I'm looking here now, thinking more about sort of nitrogen management and how do we manage residues to make sure we have nitrogen available in our systems. There's a number of different things that are sort of determining how fast those residues decay and release CO2 to the atmosphere and release nitrogen into our soils. Right, so temperature and moisture, we don't have a whole lot of control over those, but we do a little bit with tillage and whatnot. Residue quality, so the nitrogen content or lignin content is going to determine how fast it decays and how fast it releases that nitrogen. Placement, again, goes back to temperature and moisture, so whether it's buried or on the surface is going to affect things. And then the soil biological community is present. If you have a lot of earthworms or really active mycorrhizal or bacterial communities, that's going to tend to speed up the decay of that residue. So here's just an example where they took different types of residue of different varying qualities. In this case, they were looking at nitrogen content, and they mixed it with some soil, and they monitored available nitrogen in the soil over time. So when you add in alfalfa, lucerne meal here, you get a big increase in nitrogen available over time as that residue is decomposing. When you have manures, it does have nitrogen, but it's a little more complex, so it's a bit slower of a release. Whereas you put wheat straw in the soil, it's not releasing the nitrogen very fast, and then we actually get to a point where, I mentioned before that microbes are actually competing a little bit sometimes with the plants, and they can take that nitrogen back temporarily. So that's basically in this system. I mentioned before we have mineralization, but then microbes basically are doing all this, right? So microbes want to maintain a certain ratio of carbon and nitrogen in their cells, right? They want to be about 10 or 12 to 1. So most residues they're chewing on are about 20 to 1 or 50 to 1 in the case of like wheat stover. 20 to 1 is a good maybe cover crop or legume. And so, they're able to balance their cells and their carbon and nitrogen ratio by blowing some of that carbon off to CO2 and decrease the so they get rid of carbon, but they can also do it by taking nitrogen back out of the soil, available nitrogen that the plant could use, and immobilizing it temporarily while they, continue to decay things. And so that's really important to consider, because if you have a really low quality residue going in, these processes of mineralization and mobilization are happening simultaneously, but if you have a really low quality residue with really low nitrogen content, your immobilization can start becoming more important and cause you problems. So, but it's a temporary thing. It's not forever, and it's not always a bad thing, depending on some situations. So I'll give you some examples. Yes. Too fast.
So low and high quality residue here. Are we talking is that just based on the carbon nitrogen ratio of that residue then?
That's the simplest way. I mean, the simplest metric you could use to look at, and that's what I'm talking about. But
so what's a good example? So you said wheat straw is a low quality residue.
Wheat straw, yeah.
As far as the microbes are concerned, right?
Yeah, a lot of carbon relative to the amount of, there's like 50 atoms of carbon for every atom of nitrogen.
So what would be a good quality residue? Like what kind of a crop?
What kind of a crop? Well, I mean, alfalfa for one. A legume, most legumes are going to be closer down 20 to 1, 30 to 1. And microbes can decompose that really quickly. And you see that in the field. If you dump a bunch of wheat straw on the surface or mix it in, it takes a lot longer to decompose than a bunch of, cover crop or alfalfa residue or something like that.
So just like some leafy.
If it's green, it's got more nitrogen in it. There's one. Yeah. I mean, even a grass, when it's fresh and green, is pretty high nitrogen, and it'll decompose quickly. It's once they, as they get older or dry out, they start translocating some of that nitrogen out, and it becomes lower quality.
So on that, you showed Biomass or whatever, were there 2 or 3 things, but that isn't commercially really, I mean, is that really available? I mean, obviously manure is and that kind of thing, but those 3 or 4 things that were the higher, is that something that's commercially available quantity-wise?
Well, you could have it if you're growing alfalfa in your field. The first one I showed was alfalfa.
Right, so
right?
That's not an additive. That isn't like a soil amendment
No.
type of a thing. That is crop residue that you're basically saying is there.
Right. So looking at different types of things you might be dumped on your field. Okay. So this is one showing basically a similar thing. This is from the tropics where they basically have legumes, and this is nitrogen release again. So it's basically the same curve I showed before, but here when they added rice straw, which is kind of equivalent to wheat straw, you're getting negative release of nitrogen, otherwise known as immobilization. So early on, this wheat straw, or this rice straw is sucking nitrogen out of the soil, and then come about 8 or 10, 7, 8 weeks, the microbes are kind of done with it, and they've used enough of that carbon, and they're able to start releasing that nitrogen again. So it's a temporary thing. Whereas if you wanted nitrogen right away, you apply these legumes, which are of a higher quality, and they're going to have a net release of nitrogen over time. So depending on what type of residue you have and how much nitrogen available you have in the soil and how you're trying to manage it, you can kind of tweak these things to manage your available nitrogen. I'm going to just show one last example of that. Oh, so mobilization. Okay, so one last example, and I think this will segue nicely into what Katie's going to talk about. And so this might be sort of a typical plant demand for nitrogen over a growing season. We call it corn or wheat or whatever, and it's not perfect, but you're going to get something where, the plant's small, it uses a little bit, then it hits this kind of peak growing stage, and it's going to require, maximum amount per day, in terms of what it uses, and then that's going to kind of taper off throughout, as that plant comes to maturity, right? So, yeah, stick with me. And not all crops look exactly like this, but just to illustrate an idea. So, if we go back to that sandy soil in Mexico that's not holding on to nutrients very well, and we apply fertilizer to that soil, we're going to, we look at available nitrogen over time in the system. We may do a split application and apply some here. And we may have for a little while way more than that plant can use. Right? So basically, when you have more than the plant can use, you have potential for loss. At some point, that it drops off because in this soil, I'm exaggerating it, but it's down below maybe to less what the plant actually needs, and then you have a place where you're actually starving the plant a little bit, and then you give it another spike of fertilizer, and you're trying to match this plant demand, but in this really sandy soil, which I'm exaggerating with, It's kind of hard to do without a lot of applications or without like a fertigation approach or something, or just spoon feeding it little by little over the season. At the same time, if you rely completely on organic matter, you may get a cold spell. It might not be the best quality organic matter, and you may also not get as much nitrogen released as you want. So say this is a cover crop. You might not get enough nitrogen released over time to meet the crop demand. So one idea that's been promoted, and a lot of my work coming more from sort of the developing world, but I think the principles apply here, is this idea of managing your organic residues with your fertilizers together, in the sense that you may be able to kind of tamper down or those peaks by managing them together. So here the idea is that this organic matter here is maybe helping to immobilize a little bit of this nitrogen you add in your fertilizer, but then it's releasing it pretty quickly because it's actually a decent quality organic matter. And then you're able to kind of temper the extremes a little bit and better match nitrogen availability with the soil with your plant demand. And if you can perfectly match these two, you're going to have maximum nitrogen use efficiency over time. And I'll say again, this is very highly idealized, but I think it's still a valid concept when we're thinking about managing nitrogen in our fields. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because I'm already way over time. But there's been lots of good questions. Thank you for that. So just in conclusion, soil organic matter improves physical, chemical, and biological functioning or aspects of soils. They're all very important for improving overall sort of nutrient use efficiency. We need to be thinking about both above ground residues and root inputs, and considering multiple pools or multiple components of that soil organic matter, and really recognize what all of them are doing and value all those different functions being provided. Soil organic matter and plant residues are important determinants of nitrogen and other nutrient supply and availability because of that interaction they're having with mineralization and immobilization, and we can use that to our advantage in some cases. And if we really better consider decay rates and fertilization, we can hopefully use that information to synchronize better nitrogen availability and release with plant uptake. So I'm going to stop there. Probably get in trouble if I ask for questions. I don't know. No. Katie's now going to come answer all your questions, but no, go ahead. Yeah.
I do have one other question. You talk about the worms. I've been doing it 14 years. I haven't been in the workshop. Is this something that needs to be incorporated into the soil, or are they there somewhere in the color?
No, I love worms, so you don't get me started is the problem. So worms like nitrogen. So well, first off, the first big limiting factor here is water. You're just never going to have large populations of earthworms here without irrigation, period. That being said, if you had a no-till system with some sort of legume, worms like nitrogen or legumes, that's really nice quality food for them. So if you were going to find them anywhere, you'd probably find them in legume field, alfalfa, something like that. Assuming that there's enough water there for them. I don't know. Have you dug? I mean, the easiest way is to go around and look for surface castings. I'm not judging you, but I have producers I really respect have told me they have no worms in their no-till field, and I go dig and I find casts on the surface, and I find evidence of them even though there's no worm there. So they're just not there when he's looking. And so I mean, that maybe this is much drier here, so it may very well be you have no worms. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But the first thing to look for is look for the little casts on the surface. If you see those, they might be there, but I would never expect them in high abundance here. So.
Is there ever a situation where if you've been in a tilled field for 50 years and you go to no-till or whatever, would the population just not be there? And you have to introduce them again, or are they just there?
I mean, if you were so intensively tilling, and I mean, it's possible to get rid of them. And they can recolonize from the edge of fields, and I've seen some data suggesting that they can move about 10 feet a year in terms of recolonizing. So if you had a big field you were tilling intensively, it could take them a while to recolonize, but eventually they would. But like I said, this is not a great environment for earthworms, so unless you got irrigation, and then that can help a lot. Yeah. Okay, thank you.